Good afternoon and welcome to this WCMT webinar on creating your fellowship report, which is the next installment of our webinar series. Today we'll be speaking to 3 fellows that have successfully traversed the challenge producing a fellowship report, and by the end of this session we hope you'll have some tips and techniques to get you there as well. Now if you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to send them in at any point during the session and we'll address them during the Q&A at the end. Joining me in the office today are Edward Douglas, and Edward visited Canada and Sweden to research approaches to estate regeneration, interviewing a range of housing providers, residents, developers, and local and national policy makers. Hello, Edward.
Hello.
Also in the office with me today is Beth Murray, and Beth travelled to the USA to study approaches to creating an entrepreneurial culture within charities. Hello, Beth.
Hi there.
Now, also with us, phoning in from halfway across the world, is 2018 fellow Fiona Ramsey, who travelled to Colombia to research Escuela Nueva, which is a teaching strategy aimed at providing culturally relevant education. Hello, Fiona.
Hi.
Fantastic. It's great to have you here. So, we'll begin the session by each of you just giving a brief introduction to your fellowship and also some of the rationale behind your fellowship report. And from there, we'll move on to some of the other questions and challenges that you have. So, Edward, would you like to set us off?
Absolutely. So, as Tristan mentioned, my fellowship was in 2017, and I travelled to Canada and Sweden to look at estate regeneration. I had a particular focus on the role of local communities in the process of estate regeneration. And just to kind of explain, by estate regeneration, I'm talking here about kind of council estate or the equivalent in different countries, and the process of either renewing the existing homes, improving them for existing residents, perhaps building new homes. And I think the rationale for my project ultimately was that there's a big drive, and has been over the last few years, on estate regeneration in this country to improve the stock we have and to build the new homes the country needs. And I was really interested to look at the role that the communities could play in making regeneration better and also bringing more benefits to residents who live on estates around the country.
Brilliant, thanks. And Beth?
My report was looking at how non-profits and what non-profits can learn from the world's most enterprising companies. So I travelled the States. I went to places like New York and Nashville, San Francisco, and various places in California to talk to some of the world's most enterprising, fast-growing and productive companies. Take people like Facebook and Google and LinkedIn to understand how in the space of 14 years they've managed to achieve world domination, and what charities could learn practically from that in order to be able to turbocharge their social impact, make themselves as productive as possible, and help solve some of the UK's most pressing social issues.
Man, thank you. That's so interesting. And Fiona, do you want to introduce them about your fellowship and your report?
Yeah, absolutely. So I went to Colombia for my fellowship for a 6-week stint to look at the innovative Escuela Nueva model, which is essentially a student-centered approach which uses many different innovative strategies to raise educational standards in Colombia since the project has actually expanded across Latin America and the world. There's actually a pilot program in the UK at the moment putting some of those strategies into practice. And the thing that interested me most about the model was not only was it raising educational standards, it was also having a significant impact on student social competences. And I think that's something that we can all agree needs a lot of work in the UK. So I wanted to go to the country of origin and witness how the model was being implemented in schools in Colombia and see what some of these innovative strategies around building social competences in students were.
Brilliant, thank you. I think we've got a real good range of fellowships here. So I think one of the first things that we'll touch on, I think it's kind of the first big challenge that fellows think of when it comes to writing their report, is really kind of crystallising the mountain of information that fellows gain on their fellowships and on their travels, and kind of crystallising that into something which is, I suppose, comprehensible for for their audience. Beth, how did you kind of look at addressing that particular issue?
Well, first of all, I think it's never ever too early to start thinking about conclusions. So when I was traveling, in my notebook I made sure that I had the back of my notebook was totally focused on conclusions, so that I could begin to draw some macro conclusions out of all the small findings that I was coming across. I also think that it's really important that you give yourself all the information to be able to prompt you properly when you come back to the UK. So take lots of pictures, make sure that you record all the information, the interviews that you're doing with people, and if they allow you, just so that you can make sure that when you're putting together those final conclusions, you can really draw on all of the both visual prompts and the points that you didn't pick up when you were directly there to really enhance the richness of your conclusions.
And Fiona, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the thing that we spoke about, Tristan, on the phone around the fact that sometimes the report that you want to write and the report that's intended for your target audience can sometimes be slightly different for one another. And I think the one thing that's really important is just really bearing that target audience in mind and what the key takeaways that you want them to take from your report are, so that when you're structuring your report and you're thinking about how to structure it thematically, you're really choosing themes that are useful for that audience and are easy to kind of digest for that audience as well. Because I think one of the things when I was writing my report was I was trying to separate into themes that were perhaps slightly too abstract and perhaps analytical. My report being based on social competences, I tried to structure my report to look at social competences one in turn, but in the end, when I really came back to my target audience and thought about, what are the things that they're going to be interested in and what are they going to be able to take away from this, I thought, well, the themes would be better to look at the key components of the model and then have a more analytical section following that kind of delves into the social competences theme a bit more. So I think just bearing in mind your target audience from day one is really, really crucial, and that's something that I think took a couple of weeks for me to figure out, but once I had that, kind of really just helped me to kind of structure the main body of my report.
Yeah, just to build on what Fiona said as well, which I think is so important, and one of the practical ways that I was able to really consider that audience and to consider what I didn't know about that audience was to pull together a small group of trusted people who were made up of that audience and really talk them through my findings at a point when they weren't fully crystallized, in order to really understand what was of interest, what needed to be built on, and what needed to be fleshed out a little bit more in order that the report could be as useful as possible.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that before, but I think that's such an interesting way of kind of gauging what's going to kind of resonate with your target audience. And Edward, you have quite a specific audience in mind when you come to write your report. I think lots of fellows look at kind of affecting policy change, or that's what one of their goals is, but it's quite for someone who's not in that environment day to day, it's quite a kind of alien challenge, if you will. So if you could talk us through your approach, that'd be pretty helpful.
Yeah, sure. So I think on the audience point, so my audience was policymakers, and I'd had lots of experience of writing sort of similar reports in the past for that audience. So that was kind of an advantage. I think the other audience I had was kind of practitioners, which I was kind of less familiar with, and so I suppose I saw, and this is kind of a cross-cutting theme really throughout my approach to writing my report, but I sort of saw it as a process. So before I went, I spoke to the kinds of people that I'd be kind of targeting when I ultimately was distributing my report. So that meant kind of policymakers to kind of get a sense of what their real interests were, what things that they would find interesting to see in the report. But it also meant speaking to practitioners, speaking to people that work for developers or for housing associations, really getting a sense of what their practical interests were. So that kind of focused my mind at the outset. And then kind of more broadly, I think this question about kind of the volume of information that you kind of accumulate throughout the process of the fellowship. I kind of found having an idea before I went of broadly the approach I wanted to take, which was And the big thing there was kind of that I was going to use a lot of case studies. I think that was really helpful. But also while I was there, I made sure that following every meeting, I would try and write up my notes. Maybe not as kind of an essay, but just kind of a summary of the notes, and then a summary of kind of my takeout points from that. So when I got home, I had all my notes, but I had like really a short summary of each one. And yeah, that, I would say that's the same with photos and stuff. You don't want to end up with 5,000 photos. Just pick out the ones as you go, because that's when it's going to be freshest in your mind. Things that you're learning are going to be freshest in your mind then. And then as you're going through it, as you're meeting different people, visiting different projects, you're kind of developing an idea of what your kind of themes are starting to look like, and you can test those with people you're meeting. You can start to ask a few more questions, but I sort of found I was developing a framework as I was going, and that meant that when it came to kind of writing up, it was just writing up that framework rather than starting that process by the time you get home, where it's a bit too late. It's not fresh in your mind anymore. Yes, so that's my approach.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And Beth, I know you were talking about kind of the work you did with social media while you sat there, because I think a lot of fellows use their blogs and they write that, and then they're kind of using those to inform what they have when they get back. So yeah, could you talk us through that a bit?
Yeah, so my approach was, I think, again, to Edward's point about having the privilege of knowing the policy world, my background is knowing the comms world, and so understanding the audience, but also understanding how to reach the audience was really important to me. And I thought about setting up a blog, and I think it's a really valuable thing to do to capture your thoughts as you go. But in reality, I thought, well, then I have to build an audience for that blog, and that's going to be a whole bunch of work. But what do I do have is a load of Twitter followers. So instead, I kept an almost micro blog as I went along, capturing really short insights, and was able to set up a hashtag before I went away, which ultimately became the title of my report, which meant that you can actually track from the very beginning of the fellowship all the way through the travelling through to the conclusions and the outcomes, which is really helpful for me to be able to capture those. But I think to the point about thinking about the audience again, reports are really boring. And I think we all need to recognise that even if we are incredibly interested in the subject matter, there is a very good chance that we are going to print out that report and put it on our desk and absolutely never look at it, other than to feel really guilty we haven't read it. So I think we all need to be really thoughtful about how we not only put together our reports, but we need to think really thoughtfully about how we disseminate them, because it is way better for a wide bunch of people to have 2 or 3 conclusions from your report rattling around in their mind they might have seen on Twitter, or they might have seen on LinkedIn, or they might have read about in a magazine, than it is for them to have digested the sort of 30 to 45 pages of your in-depth report, from my perspective. So using social media to not only keep people interested on the journey, to gather recommendations from people that I should be speaking to build networks while I was out there, but also to then share findings in infographic and pictorial form to really get the points across.
So when you came to write your report, were you already thinking about kind of structuring it around those kind of 2 or 3 kind of takeaways?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the end I came out with 5 key characteristics that the most enterprising organisations in the world they all share, and it's a really helpful way to think about it. Let's not call it the BuzzFeedization of content, but at the same time, people respond and react really well and are able to take in content in a really managed way. And if you can chunk that down into easily digestible chunks, then I think that you will have done your job in disseminating findings far better than if you give somebody a very dense report that they might, with all the will in the world, want to read but never get around to reading.
And that reminds me of our conversation with Fiona when you were kind of saying about what you chose to structure your report around, and moving towards what you thought was more engaging for practitioners, and kind of keeping more of that in-depth analysis towards the end.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, in the end, I decided to structure my report so that my my findings were really very much a presentation of my observations and my perceptions of those observations, and which, at the beginning when I was writing this seemed kind of very straightforward to me, and I thought, does this not need to be more in depth and more analytical? But I decided to tackle that in a subsequent section, which really kind of delved into the core theme of my report, social competences, drawing back on those findings and those observations. And I actually found writing the report in that way to be much more clearer and concise than trying to delve into the kind of analytical content right at the beginning of my findings.
And I just sort of a few disparate points to kind of to build on what Fiona and Beth have said. I think I found the process of writing a blog really useful. It helped to kind of crystallise my thoughts as I went along. It provided sort of digestible chunks of information that I could kind of disseminate quite quickly. And it meant that I think when I came back, I sort of had built up a bit of an audience that probably wouldn't have existed otherwise. I think it's also really important to be clear in advance on what your report is and what it isn't. You shouldn't expect to kind of answer the whole question that you're addressing. You're looking, the value of the work you're doing is through the fellowship, through a particular and unique opportunity to go and look at specific other countries, and it's the lessons that you're learning from that people are going to be interested in. They're not going to be interested, particularly I think policymakers don't want me writing about the housing crisis and the housing market and a really in-depth 100-page analysis of what the problem is, because most people already know it, and it's not really the value that you can add, and it will tie you up if you're not focusing in on the kind of bit where you can really add value. I didn't really touch too much on kind of how you might kind of get your kind of cater your work towards policymakers, but I think like meeting people is really useful, like civil servants or MPs, they don't have much time. So if you can kind of get a meeting, you've got the credibility, you can say that you've done this fellowship, that you've kind of got these learnings that people will want to hear. So I think having a meeting where you can kind of go through them with people is actually really useful. It's not all about the report. But also just being able to summarise your recommendations by kind of grouping them thematically. I kind of had a section of recommendations on community engagement, a section on finance, and I think that means for the different audiences, people who have different interests, they kind of pick up a few of the recommendations and just kind of framing them in the right way as well. I thought was really important. So kind of what's the problem, what is it that you've learned from elsewhere, tying it into like real world examples of work, and here's your recommendation that's really grounded in the current kind of policy landscape that says, oh, here's this problem in the UK, this is what you should do about it. So it's really practical things I think are really important.
Thanks. I think, building on that point, the real challenge in some ways of the report, and I think isn't maybe stated as clearly, I think, is in translating those findings and what you've learned from abroad into that UK context, and providing the context for how your findings kind of fit in to the sectors that you work is really, really important. And Fiona, I know again from our conversation, you were talking about how you found that section actually a really good kind of starting point to get you started in writing the report, when at the beginning it can seem quite daunting.
Yeah, absolutely. The context section I think is so important, and it really is key to your report, because you will essentially base your observations and your recommendations on it, and you will keep coming back to it. And as you said, Tristan, the advice from the trust is to write your executive summary straight off the bat, which I think is a really good idea, but ultimately you probably will continue to go back and tweak and change it. But the context section is a really good section to just kind of get your creative juices flowing and write in quite a quick way. And some of this information that when you're writing it might seem very straightforward and obvious to you, but for someone that's not aware of that context that you visited, it's really interesting and really essential to the report. And I actually found that I wrote my sort of 7,000 word intro, context and glossary in a couple of days, and it did actually give me a lot of confidence for writing the rest of the report. And it also gave me an opportunity to think over my findings whilst I was writing it, and almost come up with ideas and conclusions as I was writing it, Obviously, these were things that were in the back of my head somewhere, but as I was writing them, I was thinking to myself, oh, actually, that is probably why that recommendation is how it is because of that thing that happened or that bit of information that I learned. So I think it is a really good process at the start of your report to write that context section quite quickly.
And just I completely agree. I think the context, particularly from a policy perspective, is always, well, isn't it because they have a different legal framework or they fund things differently? I think that's always the challenge when policy people are looking at recommendations from other countries. So I think kind of being able to set out quite authoritatively what that context is really important, and trying to draw parallels up front with the UK where it's similar, where it's different, I think is really important. And I mean, it's quite challenging because some of the areas that we've all worked in are complicated. There's a lot of information that you can put in there, and you can't write a 500-page book about this. So I think I found one person in Sweden, one person in Canada who knew the background and could basically kind of check it for me was really important there. Because you pick up, you can summarise what you've picked up, but actually make sure it's correct is really important as well.
Yeah, and Fiona, I know you spoke quite extensively with people from Escuela Nueva about your report and had quite a lot of feedback almost throughout the process.
Yeah, I did, and that was really very helpful. I guess I was quite lucky in that respect that my report was focused on a model, so I was able to get feedback from them, and that was really very helpful, particularly when I was writing the context section as well, because there were so many intricacies to Colombian education policy and various events that happened in the past 20, 30 years that have had repercussions for the way that things are done today. So having that constant line of communication with them was obviously really fortunate. And I was also quite fortunate because the pilot program in London, which took place last year, and this is the second year of that, I've had quite a close communication with the project manager there as well. So being able to understand the challenges that they faced in implementing the model and the kind of things that they've noticed might need to be tweaked or changed depending on the context has been really helpful in the write-up of my report as well.
And I think quite to kind of bring it back to a more broad kind of challenge that the fellows find is in kind of seeking that balance when they're looking to maybe critique or criticise some of the practices that they've seen. And I suppose for lots of fellows, they feel indebted to the people that have shared their time and kind of open the organisation's doors to them. So I wonder if you guys could kind of provide some advice and ways to kind of get around that, because it can be quite a difficult kind of subject to broach, but I think is so important for adding kind of value to the report.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to that a little bit. I think actually one of the feedback from my report, Tristan, in my first round was, can you please be a bit more critical? Because I think it is a really, really easy challenge to fall into. But I think the way that really helps me frame it in my mind is we're not here to criticise organisations. We are here to criticise ideas and practice and how they would work within the British context. So our roles are to understand practice and work out whether they would apply or not apply and how they would play out within a British social context. And I think that's really, really important to keep in mind. You can absolutely visit an organisation, entirely disagree with their practice, and write a very, very apolitical account of that, and recognise that it wouldn't work over here for X, Y, and Z. Make it really clear that you're not disapproving of their practice, whilst being incredibly respectful of the fact that they've given you time and the generosity of them opening up their doors to you.
So I was reflecting on this. I mean, I think kind of the way that I approach. I mean, so I was fortunate in the sense I didn't spend sort of a month or two with one particular organisation, so I didn't really get to the point where I felt that kind of awkwardness about sort of then presenting some kind of critique of what they were doing. But I think in each conversation I had on each site that I went on, I was kind of very clear from the outset about the kind of the challenges the UK was facing and the kind of problem I was seeking to kind of address. So that kind of grounded it in that kind of idea of or kind of an honest discussion about problems and benefits. And then I think the discussions I had with people, they were very upfront about the kind of challenging context they were operating in. But I think also, just kind of summarising to people, so you found this has worked well, this hasn't worked well, these are the challenges you face, these are the things that aren't, difficult, these are things that are working. I think having that kind of honest conversation when you're meeting people means that when you come back to them with, oh, this is my report, it's not really you're not kind of foisting it on them. They're kind of, that was the basis of your conversation with people. I think most of the time people are happy to have that conversation because everyone lives in the real world, knows that things work well and things don't work well. And also, if you're presenting this, if we think about policymakers, it's not going to be credible if you just say everything in Sweden is working brilliantly. People know that's not how it works, but you can still kind of present that in an honest way. That means you can draw out kind of the best practice stuff, and that's where I think you can really kind of hit home with your recommendations.
Yeah, I definitely echo what Beth said about critiquing an idea for the UK context rather than an organisation per se, and I think that is a really important point. And the one thing that I did before I left Columbia was I put together a slide deck which I took some people in the organisation through with just questions, just asking for more information, just so I could just make sure that I got all of my ideas straight. But essentially, they're very much experts in what they do, but we can be considered experts in the UK context, and while those suggestions I made were perhaps critical of some of the ideas, it was more a kind of critical in the context of what's going on in the UK.
Absolutely. So I think that's been really, really helpful. And another, because I think we give advice, but we've not been on fellowship, which is exactly why we're having this webinar today. And I suppose along a similar vein is how you approach the design of your report, because fellows often, talk about aesthetic, and we can say, these are some of the things, but that you can try and focus on and improve. But I suppose it'd be interesting to hear from all of you kind of how you approached the design from a very practical level.
Yeah, so I used two programs to write the actual report. So first of all, I used Google Sheets, which is an online free version of Word, because it enabled me to both access the report from wherever I was, but also meant that I could carry a very, very slimline laptop around with me around America, a Google Chromebook, as opposed to having to take my big heavy laptop. So that was really helpful because it allowed you to move content around really easily. If I thought actually that section should be there rather than here, that's really helpful. I also used, I think I ended up just using the free trial of it, but it was very useful, a tool called Grammarly, which is, and I consider myself a fairly good writer, but it made me realise actually where there was too much repetition, where there was too much waffle, where I had descended into jargon, and actually really tightened up the final version of the report. So I definitely recommend that. And then moving on to the aesthetics, the sort of the colour over the content, to the point about I wanted to make it as engaging as possible because I wanted people to read it. I also wanted to reflect that I'd been to the world's most exciting organisations, and if you walk into any of those offices, then that's the impression that all these brands gave, and I wanted my readers, charity leaders, to be as excited by the ideas that were being put forward as you feel walking into these organisations. And so I ring-fenced an element of my grant for design. I worked with a very good designer who, if anyone wants the details, do get in touch, who helped me bring that to life, so that I was able to put together something that I felt really proud of in the end.
I used a program called Canva, which is Canva. I'm not sure if it costs. I just use my organisation's subscription, but I think that you can get a free or a very cheap subscription to Canva, and it is really excellent for creating report covers. You can actually write your whole report in Canva as well, and I think one thing that I'm hoping to do over the next few weeks is to actually write a 12 to 15 page version of my report, because as it stands it's a 50 page report, and it would be nice to have that kind of designed version that I can send to people that they would probably be more inclined to read. But I definitely recommend Canva as a program to do design aesthetics for your report.
They definitely have a free version, Fiona, and if you're a charity, then you get their really premium version for free.
Oh, brilliant.
So I kept mine really simple. So I just used the pages on my MacBook, and then just did some really simple things, like just put 2 columns on each page that kind of looked like someone had designed it, but hadn't. I think I kind of put some kind of grey boxes on kind of title pages for each section, and I actually used loads of photos and used big photos on the front cover, so it kind of looked like someone had, designed it, but they hadn't. And all the photos are of these nice buildings, so you brought a lot of colour in. I had a lot of case studies, so there were lots of opportunities to use photos. And so I mean, the biggest problem I have is something very practical, which was just it created such a big file that actually converting that into like a PDF was a bit of a nightmare, and I had to use my work computer to do it. But I mean, that's the approach I took, and I thought just keep it simple. If you don't have the budget to get someone to design it, and if you don't have design skills, then that's the approach I would recommend.
And I will add that obviously all the fellowship reports we've been talking about today will be on the website, but I'll be sending those out as well. And I think Edwards is a really good example of some kind of like understated design, as well as the kind of more obviously aesthetic. So I think we're going to call it a day in terms of the discussion now, and move on to the Q&A. So on the holding slide, you should be able to see how to start submitting your questions, and if you've submitted any already, then I'll get on and find those now. So while you're all busy typing frantically away, we did have one sent in before the webinar, so I'll pose that to our panelists now, and just feel free to add anything that you think is relevant. So the fellow, and I'm sure this is a real universal feeling amongst everyone writing their reports, is that they felt quite overwhelmed about pulling the report together, having already written kind of a lot of the report to begin with. And so I guess that's kind of to do with just the volume of information. I think once you start writing it, it can kind of become this monster document that you've got to tame. So it'd be great to hear your advice on kind of how you can maybe bring that back, and tame it.
Big question. I think don't underestimate the amount of work there is. I mean, I definitely did. I definitely thought, I've got my conclusions. I started writing it while I was away. Great, I've got 3 months to come back. I can crack back into my job. And I realised about a month and a half to go that in reality it was a monster job. So I think plan your time carefully and make sure that you consider the time after the fellowship travel as much as you consider the time of the fellowship travel. I would also say, while you're away, you're immersing yourself in a different culture, but the chances are you probably also will have quite a lot of lonely evenings in hotel rooms. So use that time not just staring at the extraordinary American pharmaceutical adverts on the TV, but also use that time to really get your thoughts in order to be able to try and channel that as much as you can. But don't underestimate the amount of time it will take. Use the time you have while you're away to write. And thirdly, the stuff that took me the longest, I think, was the reviews and getting it absolutely perfect. Because I'm sure that lots of us have written work for our day jobs. I'm sure lots of us have authored reports, but probably we haven't authored reports that your mum is really interested in reading, and that you've told everybody about your travels, and suddenly people from your job are really fascinated to have a peek at. So suddenly the reputational implications of your report are raised so much that you focus a lot on getting the final version right. So build that time in as well.
I mean, I agree. I think that you should see the writing process starting kind of from the very beginning, getting the fellowship, and having like a clear idea of what your structure is to begin with just really helps to order your thoughts, and kind of refining your themes as you go, I think is really important. And while you're away, you have such a great opportunity to have a bit of headspace and just maybe spend half an hour in a cafe or something at the end of the day, just thinking through what you've learned today. Maybe not even typing up your notes, but just thinking through what were the 2 or 3 things I learned today. And then I think through that process, you start to really develop the 4 or 5 things you really want to focus on. And then everything else is, I mean, it's important, and you probably want to review it at some point, but your report isn't there to be an all singing, all dancing account of every single thing you spoke about on your fellowship. It's really kind of refining it down. And I think using the time you have while you're away is really important in that regard. I also think, if you get to a point after you're typing everything up and it's getting unmanageable, I think just stopping and getting someone you trust to have a look through it, just say, well, you don't need this in here, you don't need that in there, just really helps to kind of cut things out that you've maybe put in unnecessarily.
Yeah, I think for me it was just starting to have conversations with people. I definitely went through quite a lengthy process of feeling like all was lost and I wasn't really sure which direction I was taking. But having conversations with people, and not even experts, just people that you know, like your friends and family, and kind of if they get the idea you're trying to put across verbally, you're probably more than halfway there to actually writing it, and just talking to people, and it does help you to kind of confirm things that you already knew but just didn't know how to put into words. So I think that is really helpful.
Yeah, and I would mention that myself and the team here at WCMT are always happy to kind of read and review your reports. It doesn't need to be, it's not a dissertation. We don't have a certain amount of times we can view it before, we give it back to you. So we can see an early draft and we can help you, when it does feel like you've got a big lump of clay in front of you and you don't really know what it's going to be anymore. So always feel free to get in touch with us. So I think we'll move on. We've received a couple more questions, so I'll move on to those now. This one is about addressing, I suppose, the very literal challenge of finding the time to write the report in, between your job and your personal commitments. And if you had any kind of tips for how you can maybe embed that writing process into your regular, normal lives.
I think that Edward's point about taking sort of half an hour to an hour on a regular basis is actually is a really, really good one. So for me, that was really early in the morning. That was a case of just getting up every morning and knowing that I had half an hour every day to bosh out a bit more. Because practically and reasonably we can't be taking whole weekends. So knowing that you're chipping away at it a little bit every single day was really, really super helpful for me.
And I think just kind of, I guess my short answer is really, yeah, absolutely. I think kind of setting yourself a reasonable expectation of how much time you're going to spend on it. So that might be one morning at a weekend, a couple of evenings during the week, and then it won't get on top of you. And I think, it's okay not to spend every single waking hour other than working on your WCMT report. So I think just striking that balance is really important. And also, as Tristan says, this isn't a dissertation with a very, very hard deadline. So I think not putting too much pressure on yourself to get something done really quickly at the cost of everything else is really important.
And I think it isn't a dissertation, and there isn't going to be a grade at the end. You want it to be as good as possible, but in reality, you probably will never, ever be able to exceed what the benchmark you have in your mind. And I think my boss at the time gave me a really good piece of advice, which was done is better than perfect. Get it done. Get it written. You start chipping away at the clay once it's down on the page. Don't get frightened by the amount of work to do. Just crack on, and then when it's there, get other people's reaction. And if they're happy with it, then you probably should adjust your expectations.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's really important. I mean, I found it really helpful to build up like a group of 4 or 5 people I'd met while I was away who were happy to kind of have a look at it, and that meant it wasn't all on me to get something absolutely perfect at the end. I knew it was going through that process.
I actually had the benefit of a month off after my fellowship, which was great, but actually I put a lot of pressure on myself to get it done in that time, and I think what I actually did need was a bit of space from the findings and from what I'd learned occasionally. And so my most productive time was similar to both of you, was half an hour in the morning first thing or after work, and just knowing that I had that dedicated time where I couldn't let my thoughts wander, and that's actually when I got my most productive work done.
And I think I'll, because we are running out of time, I'll kind of link that into another question we received, which is that sometimes a bit of distance from the report can be not just healthy for your own kind of headspace, but also can be really helpful. I think lots of from receiving fellows, when they finally give me the first draft and they say, I'm going to give myself 2 weeks off. I think when you carry that burden of this report for a long period of time, sometimes a bit of distance from it is not just kind of, like I said, helpful for you, but also helpful for the findings to kind of reflect a little bit, as well as getting through writing.
But that's why we choose a subject that's like super interesting to us, right? That's why, to Edward's point, that you've got to zero in on that thing that actually fascinates you and lights a fire in your belly, because the fact is that you're going to be boshing away at that for ages. So distance is definitely important, but you need to pick a subject that you have passion about in order that it will carry you through.
And just a couple quick ones here. So you are able to produce your report as a paper for a journal, and that's absolutely fine, because that's an excellent way for you to share your findings in your sector. How much did you stick to the word count? Now, I'm pretty sure the three of you have got vastly different. And the word count really in the report guidelines is a suggestion just to kind of give you an idea about size, but I think it does vary quite wildly here, because Beth, yours is very short.
Yes. You know what? I got to the point where I was like, this is as good as it's going to get, and if I keep on writing, then it will be padding. It will be, to my point from before, it will be less pithy, it will be less accessible, and it will be less interesting to my readership, because it will feel padded. It said everything I wanted to say, and so I think I emailed you and said, said everything I wanted to say. Can I just put some pictures in? So, yeah, I think it's great that there's a guide. I think it's important to have something to aim towards, but I think that there is obviously flexibility in making sure that your report is comprehensive and thorough enough, but if it says what you want to say, great days.
I mean, I have a preference for kind of brevity in these sorts of things. I don't think anyone wants a really, really long report. Having said that, mine was kind of 70 pages long, which is longer than I'd wanted it to be, but that was because half of it was just profiling case studies, which I saw as a big part of the value that I was kind of bringing through doing my work. So even aside from the kind of the specific recommendations, actually just kind of giving people an easy way to look in and see what is happening in other countries, I thought was really important. So I did end up, and so I think what kind of in summary, I would say that it's about the audience, about what you're trying to do with the report, rather than a specific amount of words. But I think shorter is better.
Yep.
And just to go back to the earlier question, that you can indeed produce that report can indeed be a paper for publication. So we wouldn't ask you to create kind of two sister reports, one for us and one for you, because that's definitely a waste of your time. So what we really want is for you to focus on creating something which is useful for you, and allocating that time, which we know for sure is pretty limited when it comes to fitting everything into making that fellowship report as impactful as possible. Now, I am wary of time, so I think next one will be the last question, and then if we haven't been able to answer your question today, then we'll get back to you via email, so don't worry too much about that. Okay, so this one is about answering kind of additional questions kind of after their fellowship, and I think this happens quite a lot when people kind of pick up their fellowship and their findings, and then maybe they have the possibility to implement, and so you've got like a next stage of questions to be answered. So quite often, you find lots of valuable information, you think that's fantastic, this is what it is, and your kind of organisation you work for will say, oh, that's fantastic, that's brilliant, excellent, yes, please. And then there's kind of an unseen further stage of trying to implement those. And I wonder, in terms of how you've taken your findings forward since you've come back, whether that was an issue or just speak generally about how kind of implementing and disseminating since you've returned has gone.
So I don't know if I can speak too much to that, but I think, so in my day job, I'm a civil servant, I like a policy, we're very close to the team that is responsible for the policy area that I was working on, and so, what I found really useful was to go and speak to that team, kind of present my findings, and they have a lot of questions I didn't necessarily know the answer to, but actually having that conversation was really useful in disseminating those ideas, and that's kind of how I found the best way to kind of have impact with my findings. But if you were to influence policy and government was interested in doing something, I know that a number of fellows have seen their work kind of taken forward as kind of pilots, things like that. And I think if an organisation wants to take something forward, if government wants to, then they might kind of commission further work, and it's kind of interesting opportunities there. But I can't speak too much to the specific question.
I think that what we might be speaking about here as well is the value of taking tremendously good notes while you're away. And also that point about recording all of your conversations, because there will be a vast majority of questions that probably you have the answer to and maybe don't even know that you have the answer to amongst your notes. So I think keeping good notes is really, really important. A great friend of mine called Emmanuel Akpan Ingwang, who was a fellow last year, and he was investigating how social pedagogy how is rolled out amongst children's homes in the Netherlands and in Germany. And he has been able to use that as the basis for an entire business plan to be able to roll out and get funding for and bring to life a new way of delivering children's care in this country. So it's very, very possible to turn what you've done into a very, very concrete way to change lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to add to Beth's point, I think what we were talking about, Tristan, the other day was that the report really should be a conversation starter, and it's not an encyclopedia of everything that you learned while you were away. And it's meant to kind of start dialogue and create questions, and those people might then come to you with those questions, and that's when you can kind of draw on all of that knowledge through your recordings and your notes to kind of really form a discussion or a debate about your report.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's going to be the end of today's webinar. So if you had any questions that we weren't able to answer in today's session, then we'll go through those and you will receive an answer to those. I hope the session's been really helpful for everyone that's attended, and thank you to all our amazing fellows for giving up their time to talk about the fellowship report.